2009 World University Debating Championships. The motion for the round today is, this House believes that the International Criminal Court should prosecute crimes against the democratic process. In First Government, we have the team from Oxford A. Speaking first, Will Jones, and speaking second with James Gray. In opening opposition, we have the team from UCD LNH A. Nottingham A. Speaking first, James Torrance, and second, Tom Jackson. And in closing opposition, we have the team from Oxford B. Speaking first, Ling Lee, and speaking second, Vincent Sims. The opening speaker for the government to introduce the government's case. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We think that for too long, people in many countries around the world have been held hostile by sclerotic, corrupt, and violent political elites. We think this is something the international community has been too timid in standing up for. We think it is something we can and will change, and we're going to use the ICC to do it. Our proposal is very simple. We're going to grant Luis Moreno Ocampo of the International Criminal Court the ability to indict for criminal proceedings those who actively engage in gratuitous election rigging. We mean politicians who compete in those elections. We also mean the people that run those elections. As with other prosecutorial powers, this will be discretionary, so we're going to go after the big people as and where we think we can get them. We think places like Kenya recently would be a very good example. We think people like Maurice Iwu, who recently ran the Nigerian election, no relation. We think places like Zimbabwe and the Democratic Republic of Congo are prime candidates. We think there are others, and we're happy to talk about them. So, I'm going to talk about why we think this is the sort of thing the ICC should prosecute, why it's an appropriate thing to regard as within the ICC's ambit, and secondly, I'm going to talk about why we think the International Criminal Court is a uniquely effective body to allow us to set these standards and go after these people. James is then going to talk about why we think this is a particularly good way to bring about internal change for better democratic processes in those countries. So, why is this the sort of thing the International Criminal Court should prosecute? Well, we know right now that the ICC is empowered to prosecute crimes against humanity and also war crimes. We say in part the reason why the ICC was given these powers is because these are things which is extremely difficult for governments to prosecute themselves. The people who are criminals in this case often have immunity from prosecution. We often have extremely weak domestic judiciaries. We view this as a case of state failure where it's entirely appropriate to regard international jurisprudence as the appropriate mechanism. Secondly, we say this is something, not yet, where there are agreed international standards as to what constitutes this sort of stuff. The UN, the Commonwealth, the African Union, ASEAN all agree on what constitutes election rigging. We don't think that people in Nigeria are in some way culturally different and have a different cultural conception of corruption. They know what corruption is. We think they agree with us in wanting their leaders to behave better. We say thirdly, this is somewhere, an area where it's very easy to build prosecutions. We know who these people are, one moment, and there is plenty of information compiled by neutral observers as to what exactly they got up to. Yes?
So to get you straight, you're prosecuting people who rig elections, but not people who have no elections whatsoever. So dictatorships are still fine.
Well, hang on, sir. There are, of course, lots of other ways to get rid of people who are in dictatorships right now. We think trying to prosecute dictators isn't that easy. We would point out that the ICC already tries to prosecute people like Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, so we're not worried about that. We think we've got that covered. No, thank you. We think things like vote rigging, with things like vote buying in Taiwan, things like Daniel Arap Moi setting up militias to intimidate voters, kill people, and should be viewed as a violation of fundamental human rights. We think everyone agrees that an integral part of being free is being part of a polity which is genuinely democratic and can determine its own future. We do view this as just as bad as the other things that the ICC prosecutes. We would point out that the ICC treats rape as an act of genocide. We think these people are raping their countries, and it's about time we did something about it. So, why is the ICC fantastic? Firstly, because we say it has institutional capacity in the types of countries we are talking about. There are ICC tribunals which already exist in Arusha and Lome, Arusha in Tanzania, Lome I think in Togo, but I'm not sure. We say these people have the institutional capacity, the staff, the background, the knowledge, and the contacts with these kind of policies to be able to build prosecutions. Secondly, we say that the ICC has historically been very good at working with these policies. If we look at the recent indictment of Rose Kabuye in Berlin, who was involved in war crimes against Hutus during the 1994 genocide, we think that's a pretty good example. If we also look at the recent indictment of Laurent Ngola-Nataye in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we see that what the ICC is able to do is work with governments in Africa. It's able to be seen as not an instrument of Western interests in that way. We think the indictment of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan is a particularly good example of why the ICC is so effective, because it is able to be independent of entrenched power interests in a way that the UN is not. It was able to resist the pressure from people like Russia to not indict him for acts of genocide. They went after him anyway. We think that's another pretty good reason to regard the ICC as fantastic and able to resist being looked at as in some way imperialist and Western. Finally, no, thank you. We say that the International Criminal Court has been shown to be extremely effective at setting international norms of jurisprudence. In 1996, the International Criminal Tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania, was the first place to define rape as an act of genocide in prosecuting Rwanda. That jurisprudential move has been followed by judiciaries across the world. It shows that the ICC is, firstly, it shows that the ICC historically is a body which extends its brief as and where it sees that to be appropriate, but it also shows that it's very successful at doing that. It can effectively signal to other nations, and it has consent norms which are followed and implemented. So, what have we shown you today? Firstly, very simply, we think that this is a crime which should be regarded as appropriate for the ICC to prosecute. It's exactly the sort of case where international jurisprudence is required. It's exactly the sort of place where we can and do build prosecutions, and it's exactly the sort of case where there are international standards which can be followed. Secondly, we think the ICC can very effectively go after this body. I beg your pardon?
I made a mistake.
You've actually timed me wrong, have you? Yes. Right, in which case a bit more on international standards. Good Lord. Right, okay. So the basic idea with the setting of international standards, thanks guys, is that we look at the places that many of these theocratic regimes are actually places where, although the government doesn't work or the executive doesn't work, judiciaries remain very, very effective. If we look at places like Nigeria, where senatorial elections were successfully cast down, if we look at Zimbabwe, where practically the only thing that works is the judiciary and remains with a degree of independence and a degree of professionalism not seen in the rest of the Zimbabwean state, we think going through this judicial route and empowering them by setting these kind of international norms is an extremely effective way of trying to get these countries to behave themselves and giving people inside those countries the power to push for that change. Right, am I now at 7 minutes? Thank you. Well, I've got about 10 seconds, is that right? Well, basically we've said two things. Firstly, we think it's very, very appropriate for the ICC to go after this particular crime. Secondly, we've said the ICC is a very effective body. We hope it will continue to do so. I'm very pleased to propose.
I thank the speaker for his truncated remarks. Apologies to the House, and call upon the first speaker for the opening opposition.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to look at a few things in this speech. I'm going to talk about the rebuttal.
I'm going to talk about jurisdiction and why domestic routes are better to follow, something that Will didn't deal with at all in his speech, why we can deal with a lot of these things domestically, either through domestic courts or through negotiation. I'm going to talk about why discretion would always point to not having this law in the first place and why it's therefore a silly law. And then lastly, I'm going to go on to look at the idea of legitimacy and the role of the court. Ian's going to go on to talk about why we don't think democracy is necessarily an automatic good, why we think it's actions that determine whether or not we should prosecute people, and why we don't think this meets the burden of the International Criminal Court. So firstly, we have this idea that this is just as bad as the other things that the International Criminal Court prosecutes for. That's simply not true, ladies and gentlemen. This is not rape, this is not pillaging, no matter how much Will likes to argue that it is. Why isn't it the same? Because it's not the same because it doesn't involve a direct and tangible harm to citizens in the way that this does. It's not the same because it's not a crime against humanity in the same way that we consider other things to be crimes against humanity, because it doesn't strip people of their dignity and it often doesn't strip people of their choices in any way greater than other ways of stripping them of their choices, such as running bad economic policies which mean they have less money, which gives them less choice. We think it's a way of depriving people of choice, but we don't think it's a way of depriving them of choice which deprives them of their humanity, which we think is the fundamental precept of the International Criminal Court. Moving on, he said it's not going to be seen as Western, but we think that's the case at the moment because of the types of things that it's prosecuting. However, let's look at the context in which these things are going to be prosecuted. All the examples he pretty much gave you are in Africa, so it will be seen as that because other types of prosecutions have taken place in the West. We can even see with Milosevic, when he was brought to the International Criminal Court, that did lead to it being seen as a Western imposition and domestic strife, and that's something I'm going to go on to look at later in terms of the domestic impact that these prosecutions will have. Last is this idea that it's good at setting international norms. That's when, ladies and gentlemen, we get a policy that everybody can agree with. Everybody can agree that genocide is an absolute and abhorrent action against all of humanity. If you were to prosecute Vladimir Putin for this policy because he rigged votes in Russia, we think you'd have the resentment of most of the Russian population, several of the states that are allied with Russia, and that's how you undermine the legitimacy of the court, not just in this regard, but you undermine their capacity to set international norms in other regards. And I'm going to go on to look at that in my substantive. I'll take Will before I move on.
When ZANU-PF takes MDC activists and beats them and gags them and puts them in solitary confinement for weeks, do you think that might strip away some part of their humanity?
You see, what's interesting about that is a crime within that country, firstly, but also that is a crime against humanity because they're committing actual physical actions where they beat people, where they rape them, where they do the things that you said meets the burden of international prosecution in terms of genocide, because they're killing people through things like cholera, which result from that. But also, we think we have to look, moving on, at jurisdiction and why domestic change is better. Because the reason he said we wouldn't prosecute people with regard to dictators is because, well, we prosecute them for their actions at the moment. Well, we say there's a distinction between saying we prosecute them for their actions and for being inherently anti-democratic. So that's the first thing we want to look at. It's actions as opposed to just democratic function. The second, he said, it's really, really hard to get them. Well, we'd agree with you there, ladies and gentlemen, but we'd say that harm still falls on our side of the house, where it's also really hard to prosecute the people in these circumstances. Why is that important? Because we'd say, given that it is almost impossible to bring these people to justice, given that most of the examples of the indictments that he mentioned haven't been brought to court in the first place, we'd say it's better to seek a domestic avenue first. Why is that? Because we say there are two avenues through which domestic change is possible, and they'd be better. Those two avenues are domestic courts or through negotiation. Domestic courts, firstly. We say there are domestic court processes in many of these countries which can arbitrate on these things themselves. They said these aren't things that governments can decide for themselves. Many of these countries have court systems which can decide them. We don't think necessarily superimposing yourself over those courts is the right way of dealing with things. But secondly, through negotiation. Given that these are large, power-based people, given that you're not likely to remove them, we'd say that the domestic process is more likely to impinge in a negative way by imposing this than by not imposing it. And it's better to have negotiation as your end result. Why is negotiation better in these countries? Well, negotiation is better because it allows you, ladies and gentlemen, to have a domestic resolution of this problem. Why is a domestic resolution better? Because when you see an international imposition from the outside, we think that's more likely to result in negative harms to the population. So that moves on to my second point. Where are the conditions where people are capable of damaging this population, where they're capable of rigging votes? Well, I'd say where you have powerful groupings that have strong domestic support and that probably have military support as well. What's the likely end result when you see the international community trying to impose their will on them? Is it that they give in, that they create the democratic reform that they want, and they give up their leader to the democratic process, making them more likely to do things like negotiate domestically? Or is the end result likely to be that they will grab more power? We think you disincentivise them to negotiate with other groups in their countries, you disincentivise them from dealing with their population, and you incentivise them to see the international community as somebody who's imposing their will on them. Why is that bad? Because it means the harms in terms of restricting people's choices, the harms in terms of people being dictatorial and doing bad actions against their populations are more likely to occur under their proposition. Why is that likely to result? Because the population has strong support for these people, because they have strong domestic support, and because they're worried about their power position, so they're more likely to clamp down on domestic opposition. Under our side of the House, they always have an incentive to negotiate where there are two power groupings so that they can achieve an equitable solution within their parliament, within their own domestic system. Under their side of the House, they don't have that incentive, and as a result of not having that incentive, we think they're more likely to crack down on their own opposition.
Okay.
Last point, I'll take you before I go on.
Right, the ICC doesn't prosecute if the domestic legal system shows itself willing and able to do so. This will actually encourage that to happen, because if they don't do it, they know they're going to see the inside of The Hague anyway.
Well, firstly, we'd say they don't know they're going to see the inside of The Hague, given that all the analysis we gave you that they aren't currently being brought there under the current indictment. Secondly, we'd say sometimes the domestic courts would be able to arbitrating it in a certain way. Even if that was a bad way, we'd say all the other harms still exist on our side of the House. Moving on, legitimacy and the role of the court. Why do people sign up to this court in the first place? What Will misunderstood is that this is a voluntary decision to sign up for the International Criminal Court. It's not something that we impose on other people, it's something people choose to sign up to. Why would you not simply choose to abscond yourself from the treaty in the first place, rather than be subjected to this? Moreover, how do we undermine the legitimacy of the court? Because we're straying into areas where people see it as an interference in domestic affairs, not because of international norms, but because of Western interference. Let's take a case study of this. Were we to say, issue a writ against Vladimir Putin because he encouraged all civil service workers to bring in their voting card to work, would that be seen as a Western imposition? I think we can legitimately say that it would. What does that do? It undermines the court in all the other areas that they talked about it being necessary to implement policies, and it makes it harder for them to implement policies with regard to things like human rights. So it's because it doesn't make things better, it's because it makes it harder to resolve the situation domestically, and it's because it undermines the International Criminal Court, generally with its other aims, that we're proud to stand here today and oppose it.
For his remarks, and call upon the second speaker for opening comments.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is show you why allowing these particular regimes to continue is particularly damaging for the long-term sustainability of those countries. I'm going to talk about a particular type of regime, which I'd like to call electoral authoritarian regimes, and why their control of the elections in this particular way ends up making these countries less likely to ever become democratic, and puts them on a path which removes them from having the ability of local people to make decisions for themselves. But firstly, some points of rebuttal. Firstly, he said, well, the ICC doesn't actually prosecute anyone, it's not very successful. That's wrong. We see, for example, in Arusha, where they've been very successful at convicting people who committed genocide and war crimes in Rwanda. We see where the Rwandan state has actually gone into Congo to find people to prosecute for those crimes. We see where Rose Kabuya, when on holiday in Europe, was recently arrested for the crimes that she committed in Rwanda and is now going to face trial. We see that Lauren Laguya Zagola Natalia from the DRC is currently going to face trial for crimes of genocide. It does happen. Secondly, they told us, well, no, we need to solve this from the domestic scenario. We already heard a bit of information. The ICC won't go in if the domestic courts can do it. That's not a problem. When that exists, they can. But more importantly, domestic institutions don't exist as independent arbiters to judge these individuals. This is the crucial institution that is lacking from these countries. There is no independent arbiter to judge whether these people are guilty or not. What we supply is that crucial institution which enables elections to be stable and democratic in the long term. Something which in the West we are lucky to have within our own countries, but something which does not exist within the countries that are electoral authoritarian countries. Finally, on this point of domestic issues, they said, well, the reason that these governments win is because they have strong support at home. Ladies and gentlemen, they've just had to rig an election in order to win. They obviously do not have strong support at home. And even if of the support that they do have, which he mentioned, which was militias and armies and the like, those are the very institutions which stop these people from negotiating with other groups, which prevent them from changing the way that they govern and becoming democratic. The only thing those individuals fear is an outside group. And these individuals who we are prosecuting are going to be afraid of this because they do want to go on holiday to Europe like Rose Kabuye did, even though she thought she was going to get prosecuted. And they are the only things that these particular people will actually harm them. No. Thirdly, he said there's no direct harm. What? We are stripping the basis of humanity from these people, which is the capacity to make independent choices and have independent actions on their own lives. But more importantly than that, what stems from these electoral authoritarian regimes? The capacity of governments to continue to murder and massacre their people when they don't agree. We think there's a very tangible harm that exists in this case. We are prosecuting actions. Finally, my last point of rebuttal is he said, oh, what about people like Putin? Well, we do what we can, ladies and gentlemen. The ICC may not be able to prosecute all people that rig elections. We accept that. That's not a double standard. That's a basic principle of how you prosecute someone. Where we don't have the ability to prosecute someone, we don't have the resources to do it, the ICC will not do it. That's unfortunate. But there are an enormous number of situations like the ones we've given you that ensure that they can do it in some scenarios. So what are we trying to do? And right, this is our positive matter. We're trying to remove impunity at the top. And the only way we can do that is by supplying an independent arbiter. We think that there is a new type of institution that is emerging. An institution that, like in Angola with the Santos, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya with Kibaki, Gabon with Omar Bongo, and Benin with Gambi. What is that institution? No, thank you. That is where they use the facade of elections to build up popular legitimacy. The international community has traditionally looked on these regimes as being on the path to democracy, something Whitehead calls floating but anchored democracies. We don't think that is the case. These are pretend democracies who are setting up elections to sustain their legitimacy in the long term, to continue to get aid and the like from the West in the short term, no thank you, and in order to keep themselves in power. But they're not in any way democratic, and they do actively oppress their populations and set themselves up on a path towards long-term harm. Yes.
Can you name me one country that went straight from dictatorship to full and free democracy without at least a grey phase in between?
South Africa. Now, more importantly than anything, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that the difference between those countries like South Africa and like, in some cases, Senegal and the like, is that what they have is they have a stage before they become democracies where the rules of the game are established. In those scenarios, they set up rules of the games under conditions of uncertainty where no one knows the outcome that are fair and true to all people. What happens in these scenarios is that a dictator sets up elections, sets the rules of the game so that he knows that he was going to win. And they don't have local independent arbiters, and they can't provide those. So what happens is even if the ruler leaves power, like in Zambia, the new rulers use the same rigging methods and institutions that were set up to continue to pervert the rules of the game. And why is this? Because we think it is in some sense path-dependent to allow these elections to continue. These elections stop countries from becoming more democratic in the long term. They create institutions of control which take a long time to set up, but once set up are very hard to remove. They decrease turnout. Now, my thesis is on turnout, and I've done a regression of 642 elections, and I can tell you that incumbents in power who use violence significantly reduce the amount of participation of local people. That's bad because they lose faith in democracy as a whole. And you have a concept of many African people called democracy corruption, and they lose faith in that system. We think that's particularly dangerous for the long-term continuance of these democracies. We have an opportunity by prosecuting individuals who rig elections and prosecuting people who run those elections in a bad way in the beginning to stop those institutions from being sustained and created. And it's only if we can stop those institutions from being sustained and created that we remove the legitimacy from these leaders and we can make them democratic in the long term, something which they haven't dealt with. We strengthen local judiciaries. by giving them an outside body of law to appeal to, but also by giving them an outside enforcer. If they judge someone to have rigged an election and no one inside does something, the ICC can step in and do something about it. It strengthens local people, like women in Rwanda, who independently brought claims of rape to the ICC. We can see people are going to be able to do this in this scenario. And it means that elites are afraid. It means they can't travel. It means they can't leave their countries. It means if a foreign power in a destabilized regime invades, like the Rwanda did in the Congo, you can be brought to justice. This is all these maniacs fear. They fear prosecution, ladies and gentlemen, and we think under our model is the only way we can sustain democracy in these countries in the long term. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the second speaker for opening opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to have a look at two real issues in this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to have a look at crimes against democracy not really being crimes against humanity. I'm going to give some analysis to why that's the case, ladies and gentlemen. I'm also going to have a look at the idea of internal change and how this won't actually occur under the propositions model. Before I do that, I wanted to deal with a couple of things that don't really fit into that situation. Because we heard about the idea of ZANU-PF going around beating up people at election time, ladies and gentlemen. We say, well, the court wouldn't prosecute this happening in a non-election framework, ladies and gentlemen. They wouldn't prosecute the idea that, beatings are going to happen then. So we say, what is so special about the election framework? The election framework is only a facilitation of choices. And this I'm going to deal with a little bit more in terms of a look at why the idea of expressing a preference is not necessarily a human right to the same extent of your right not to be killed, ladies and gentlemen, or your right not to have genocide committed against your entire people. We think there's a real difference there. I'm going to outline that a little bit more. No, thank you. In the first point. Secondly, I want to point out that people will abscond from the court's jurisdiction, ladies and gentlemen, and this is going to harm the court's ability to prosecute crimes against humanity, something which James fundamentally failed to deal with at all. If I feel that this is going to happen, I'm going to take myself out of this treaty, and then when I commit genocide against my people, ladies and gentlemen, that is not going to be prosecutable because I no longer signed up to this situation. No, thank you. James also told us these people don't have strong support. Well, he's mixing up the difference between strong and majority support. We're saying they may well not have majority support, but they probably have strong support, including the army, ladies and gentlemen, and it's going to be quite difficult to go in and get them. No thanks. He also told us, basically, that what the real issue here is that effectively we're stripping choices, ladies and gentlemen. Say, governments can strip choices all of the time. Democratically elected governments can strip choices all of the time. They can impose restrictive laws. They can ban political parties that aren't necessarily deemed to be appropriate, ladies and gentlemen. These are restrictions on people's choices. These are not crimes against humanity. A restriction on somebody's choice and on an expression of preference is not the same, as I said earlier, as having yourself killed. No, thank you. On to my points, ladies and gentlemen. So crimes against democracy are not crimes against humanity. Because we say humanity is inherent. Genocide is the destruction of humanity, the destruction of a human race, ladies and gentlemen. Democracy, no thank you, is not. Because there are other methods of governance, much and all as we might not like to admit it, ladies and gentlemen. Some of them can even actually afford rights to people. If you have benevolent dictatorships or some such thing, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that democracy is a fundamental part of our being. We don't think that democracy is inherent to humanity in the same way that living is inherent to humanity, ladies and gentlemen. Because you can live, you can exist without democracy. You can't exist unless you're alive, ladies and gentlemen. No thanks. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that subversion of democracy does not equal the destruction of a human race. No thank you. And a vote is merely an expression of preference. Because decisions which damage the economy, such as like pro-cyclical economic decisions, ladies and gentlemen, damage our ability as individuals within that society to make preferences, ladies and gentlemen, and to decide what we would prefer. What goods I would prefer, whether I would rather a green apple or a red apple, or something along those lines, ladies and gentlemen. My ability to choose between objects is not exactly inherent, and we wouldn't prosecute people for decisions which damage the economy, ladies and gentlemen, such as supporting parties, such as things like that. And I'm going to take second on this before I move on, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead.
Do you not agree that as we rightly express our freedom of speech here, we also have an obligation to defend people's rights to most basic autonomy over the way they live and the way they are governed? Why should we not be doing it?
I think there's a difference between the way we live and the way we are governed, and whether those are fundamental autonomous rights, ladies and gentlemen. The way we live is not necessarily inherent to the way we are governed. You can live your life within a more restrictive or an anti-democratic framework. You can't, the situation of being dead suffers that, ladies and gentlemen. That's the distinction we're trying to make here. Is the idea, and this moves me back to the idea of facilitating preferences and the economic things, ladies and gentlemen, that deal with that. The destruction of preference is not a crime against humanity. No. So, we also mentioned the idea of dictatorship. You raised this on a point of information we heard. And in fact, nothing, ladies and gentlemen, in real response. What we heard from Will was that, we'll go after them anyway, ladies and gentlemen. No. We don't prosecute dictators for being dictators. We prosecute dictators when they commit acts of genocide against their people. And what we say is what you're doing is you're actually encouraging more people to become dictators, undermining the democratic process that you set, even accepting your premise as democracy is the best thing that we should be attempting to achieve. You undermine the actual ability for people to have democracy because people are more likely to go and say, well, I'm not going to hold an election because, I might be indicted for my actions while I hold that election, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. We think this is why when we talk about the necessity for transitional phase, ladies and gentlemen. Have a look at Musharraf, ladies and gentlemen, in Pakistan. Have a look at the idea here that, yes, he hasn't always been great. Yes, there are problems with it, ladies and gentlemen. But in terms of a domestic process reaching a point whereby you can then facilitate free elections, there will always be a transitional phase whereby there will probably be some corruption, there will probably be some problems in that society. No, thank you. We think those are things that are going to happen, and we shouldn't discourage people from making those first steps towards democracy. We shouldn't discourage those people from making those steps because they're going to then be indicted by the international community for saying, you didn't do this well enough, ladies and gentlemen. You didn't get there first time. Whoever here, who broke at Worlds in their first go and then didn't, people don't always do that. You don't always succeed first time round, ladies and gentlemen. Doesn't mean you should stop trying. What we say is that people should not be discouraged from taking steps to actually, come back or to keep going along a framework which we see as being preferable. In terms of the internal change, ladies and gentlemen, I have been dealing with this a little bit in terms of my dictator stuff. Because we say, firstly, genocide still happens. The existence of the ICC and its prosecution for genocide, ladies and gentlemen, hasn't stopped genocide outright. We say that, why would this be any different in terms of, internal change is more likely to occur this way. We don't think that's necessarily true because we think what happens is you're more likely to have people clamp down on the internal dissidents within their grouping, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure they cling on to power because, when you're indicted by the ICC, the only way the ICC actually gets their hands on you is when someone else takes power in your country. So what you do is, if you're indicted, you actually lead to a further grasping of the power, ladies and gentlemen. It leads to more dictatorships, more oppressive dictatorships, and that we think harms the actual human rights, the actual physical human rights of those individuals in those countries. And it's for all those reasons that I'm more than happy to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the first speaker for closing comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, what we've had from opposition so far is if at first you don't succeed, you should try again, and if you happen to beat up your opposition in the meantime, nobody should say anything about it. We think that that's wrong. We think that their entire idea about fostering internal change is actually helped by this process, and I'm going to talk about why. Firstly, let's have this idea of domestic courts that we had early on in the debate. And we told them about it once, and they told us about domestic courts again. They appear not to have listened, so let's go round again. In terms of increasing the ability of domestic courts to deal with these things, firstly, if they can and will, the ICC doesn't have anything to do with it and congratulates them. Secondly, if we know that they will be indicted, right, then that increases the desire of the courts. It makes the courts bolder to indict them themselves because they know that they have some protection. It sends out a very, very strong international jurisprudential norm. Okay, we think that that's also good. Furthermore, if they do get indicted, that puts massive restrictions on their ability to travel. Okay, they like doing that. They like doing things like maybe going to the UN and stuff like that. And we think that if they can't do that, that harms them as a regime. It prevents them from gaining international legitimacy and contributes to their eventual downfall. We think that that is a good thing, ladies and gentlemen. But finally, he sat there and went, oh, well, if they, maybe it's difficult. And what we say is that if you are immune from the reach of the International Criminal Court, we think that you're going to be immune from the reach of any of your domestic courts anyway, so we don't think that you're going to discourage domestic prosecution because of this. We also have this idea of, no, you'll undermine fledgling democracies. No. What we'll get is a stick with which to encourage them to progress on to being genuine democracies, okay? We have this idea that, oh no, we'll have more dictatorships because they won't even bother holding an election. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is at the end of the day, if you're being beaten and oppressed anyway, what's the point in having a sham election? It doesn't actually contribute anything to you, okay? I'd rather call a spade and know that somebody is a dictator than have somebody poncing around saying, well, I won an election, when no, they didn't, okay? Also, we have this idea that, oh, well, they'll leave the ICC and you won't be able to prosecute them for crimes against humanity. Okay, Sudan has not signed up to the ICC idea. It's not signed up to the Rome Accord. The reason we can go after them is because the ICC can be told by the UN to look at it. It's called the UN mandate, right? We think that that will still exist, even if Sudan, who haven't signed up to it anyway, do suddenly go, oh, well, the ICC isn't a great idea. We think if you're committing crimes against humanity, you're probably going to be pretty critical of the ICC. At the same time, it's not effective. Right, the legitimacy of governments. Because we heard a lot from OP about why, oh, well, if you're not protecting the right to life, it's not worth doing. And we say, firstly, okay, we think if you're able to rig elections, that pretty much, adds to your ability to commit genocide. No, thank you. I'd rather prevent genocide than sit there and go, oh, well, we wanted you to hold a rigged election, and then you committed genocide, so we're going to prosecute you for that. I'd rather the people didn't die in the first place. But even so, actually, I will take it, yeah.
Should not accept that a vote is simply an expression of choice. Why would you not therefore prosecute governments
let's
that
deal
give
with
a choice
this,
in
because it
other
came up
ways?
in a point of information, right? A vote is essential to you enacting your autonomy within the way you live, okay? Furthermore, we think that because governments have such a massive effect on your life, it's important that you have a say in that. Also, we think that if you have the option of choosing a government that would be good for you, or a government that will cause a cholera outbreak by running out of water purification chemicals, we think that that's quite essential to your ability to live. We think that democracy is an essential reflection of your basic idea of your basic autonomy, and no thank you, and we think that that's good. He put a lot of store by the right to life. Newsflash, there are other rights too, and all of them are oppressed by anti-democratic governments, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. Right, let's add to this a little bit more. Why do we say that anti-democratic governments are bad? Fundamentally, it's because they lack legitimacy, okay? We believe that the legitimacy of governments is derived from the assent of their right to govern by the people, right? If you are anti-democratic, now here's an interesting thing, right? Because of the extra recognition you get within the international community, we think that there is an incentive for dictators to actually be democratic. We think that therefore, if they are likely to win an election, they will hold a proper election. That means that the only people who don't hold an election are the people who would lose that election, right? That means that they are the unpopular people. They're the people whose government, they're the government whose people actively don't want them in power, and we think that that's bad because that's an act of oppression in and of itself. Secondly, the idea of harming existing democratic ideas, because we think that, again, this is a problem. Because if you say that the only thing that matters is that you hold some form of election, right, then we think that that's bad. Because we think that that means that some dictators can claim legitimacy because they won an election. We think that that's bad. We think it should be clear that you rigged that election, and we think that we ought to be able to prosecute you for doing so. We think that this damages everybody because it harms our ability to impose sanctions upon them. If you turn up and they're like, oh, we've won all these wonderful elections, blah, 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 and you're like, well, you rigged them, and we say we'd like to put sanctions upon you, and they say, oh, but I won an election, I have legitimacy, it's nice to be able to say, actually, you don't, and you're going to The Hague because we think you're an abhorrent human being. So, ladies and gentlemen, what have I told you? Fundamentally, this does not affect the rights of domestic courts in any way. In fact, it encourages them to enact their rights. Secondly, being anti-democratic is an innate harm, A, to all of your rights, partly because it denies your ability to choose lots and lots of things, and also partly because rigging elections provides dictators with the ability to do all the things that they're really worried about. We'd rather be preventative than punish them. And also because they don't have any legitimacy, that creates harms in the international community. For those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and the first speaker for closing opposition.
The UAE, Congo, Cambodia, Kuwait, the Gambia, Jordan, Uganda. These are all dubiously democratic countries that have signed up to the ICC. These are nations whose cooperation we value, not just in dealing with their own problems in their own countries, but also in helping us to deal with problems in neighboring countries, helping us to hand over the sorts of evidence and suspects which the ICC needs to function properly. We think that their case is going to damage the ICC's ability to do the one thing that it was specifically designed for and is very good at. So I've got two main areas that I'd like to extend, and I'm going to rebut along the way. The first is that their case reverses the spread of democracy and our ability to call a spade a spade. The second is that they are going to harm the actual process of prosecuting real genocide and real crimes against humanity. So let's start with the first. We've been told essentially that good governance is a prerequisite for your being human, and that otherwise governments that aren't democratic lack legitimacy, etc., that we must be able to tell which governments are not democratic so that we can sanction them. I have news for closing government. We can usually tell which countries run sham elections in the first place because we've got observers there. But the important thing is, unlike genocide and real crimes against humanity, when you rig an election, there aren't dead bodies on the ground. Crucially, our ability to detect rigged elections depends on our having observers from the UN, from the EU, from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what have you. On their case, the ICC can only begin proceedings to indict you. This is the way the ICC works, if it has some evidence you rigged an election. That means that countries where they're not sure if they can control their subordinates to stop them from stuffing ballot boxes, countries, for instance, that may think that, countries where they think that they could have some sort of democratic legitimacy but aren't willing to go all the way, will eject these observers. So we aren't going to be able to discriminate between the countries that are really democratic and those that aren't, because there is a significant population of quasi-democracies which have degrees of democratic accountability. Their policy will destroy our information about, which means one, no, that we can't indict them, and two, we don't know which to place sanctions on and how severe those sanctions should be. Further Furthermore, we think that the problem with their policy is that it encourages the division of nations along binary lines into those that are democracies unabashedly and those that aren't. That's dangerous because it creates a very noxious atmosphere for the spread of democracy. It implies essentially that the countries that are trying to join the club, albeit imperfectly, should either get all the way in, which is very difficult for them, or should be kicked all the way out. We think, furthermore, that fake elections are often precursors to real and effective ones. No, we've seen this in Pakistan. We've seen this in Egypt. Very often this happens for 3 reasons. One, fake elections build the institutional capacity to hold a real one. No. Two, when a government stops claiming that its mandate is from God, stops claiming that its mandate is from Marx, and holds an election, that tends to be a binding thing. People tend to demand elections in future. We think this is a valuable paradigm shift. No, which is important about moving virtually all post-Soviet states in a democratic direction. And the third reason is this: we think it just keeps the discourse alive. Look, it's not true what James said when he said it's about institutions of control that perpetuate rigged elections. It's very hard to perpetuate these institutions of control precisely because when you rig an election, it's got to be informal and under the table. That means that there aren't formal institutions that persist from one election to another. What persists is the fact of the election and the fact of the ballot box. That's immensely helpful, and their policy destroys that. No. I asked James if he could name me one country that made the transition straight, and he said South Africa. That's just a lie. Even before apartheid ended, South Africa held elections. They were pretty crap elections. No, the rights of black people weren't assured terribly well. We think the functioning of their current model of democracy is at least partly dependent on the fact that they weren't a dictatorship before. Second. Yes, James.
So that is not true in any way. There weren't elections for white people in South Africa.
Yes.
There weren't elections for the general population.
So I agree then that these were partial and imperfect elections, involving only some segment of the population. They were an important precursor to real ones because it meant that the white government acknowledged that its people should select who governs them, and all we needed to do was expand the definition of people. The second thing is this: it harms the prosecution of genocide. Because we think it's very important that states buy into the idea of some kind of ideologically neutral idea of what a crime against humanity is. The problem is this: China will agree that it's wrong when you have mass rape. They will agree that it's wrong, when you have the Holocaust. They aren't going to agree that it's wrong when you stuff ballot boxes. The problem is that when you don't have an ideologically neutral conception of what a crime against humanity is, we can't get states on board. We think the reason why we have successful ICC courts in, say, Cambodia and not in Sudan is because Cambodia signed up. We agree we can issue an indictment against the head of Sudan, even if Sudan doesn't sign up. No, we just don't think we can make effective this indictment in those circumstances. The second thing, which is remarkably important, is the fact that very often we need cooperation from other states to deal with criminals who flee into them. When Charles Taylor flees into another dubiously democratic state, we'd quite like that state to cooperate with us so that we can extradite him. No, we think that they massively destroy the ability of the ICC to be the sort of ideologically neutral actor that non-democratic states will support not just by signing up to, but by giving evidence to, by extraditing people to, by lending the moral weight of the world behind. We can't do that when we've got this sort of concept. So, what have we brought today? We've brought to you essentially the idea that it's not the, yes, we need to call a spade, but to call a spade, we need to know what are spades and what aren't. And their policy makes it very likely that the people who are spade monitors will cease to be in the places where we'd like to demonstrate which spades are where. No. The second thing is, we've shown, moreover, that the spread of democracy requires a sort of transitional phase for all sorts of important reasons. And quite frankly, their policy divides democracies and non-democracies in a way that is noxious to the continued growth and development and just the discourse of democracy that even authoritarian democracies buy into, even authoritarian electoral regimes buy into, and that's crucially important. And the third thing is this: the ICC is not unlike the WHO. It's very good at a specific task. It requires for that task the veneer of neutrality and the assent of the world. It requires for that task the cooperation of many countries in messy conflict zones that will often not be democratic. If we want it to be effective at this task that it was designed for, we need to make it stick to that task. For that reason, we shouldn't make it prosecute people who just stuff ballot boxes. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
speech to defend democracy. We have shown you the massive harms that sham democracies cause, both in principle and in practicality. We have shown you why the ICC is the best body to do this and how it actually works. That's how I'm going to summate this case. Before I do so, let's finally get on this idea of how do we call a spade a spade. Oh no, so the military dictator decides to chuck observers out. That's exactly the same thing that Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, and yet we still know what has gone on in Zimbabwe, ladies and gentlemen, because people went in covertly. That's exactly the same thing we can see working under the status quo. We have absolutely no problem with that. We've got enough spades tellers, if you will. Okay, why do we think it's so important that we defend democracy? Now, firstly, I'm going to explain why we think it is actually inherent to humanity, and that deals with both the ops cases. Firstly, this idea that it's something to do with life, and secondly, that the South African elections were great precursors. And then after that, I'm going to look at the problems that sham democracies have sort of practically and in terms of the democratic ideal. Okay, so firstly, ops stand up and say crimes against humanity are all about the preservation of life. But at the same time are prepared to accept that systematic rape is also something that is a crime against humanity and that the ICC get involved with. We think, why is that? Because that is one of the choices, the choice to ensure you preserve your bodily integrity, which we think is absolute. Then, what do we get out from Shane Wu? Well, we like the South African elections because they were precursors, because they said only some people were actually human, ladies and gentlemen. As soon as you turn around and say that there is this group of what we would consider to be people who aren't people, you are denying them their humanity. So under both of their logics, it failed. And finally, this idea of choice. No, well, we think this is the most basic of choices, ladies and gentlemen. It's the ability to choose who is going to be enacting your laws, like your and your legislative program. And this is why James started bringing in terms of the harms that sham democracies cause to the democratic ideal. Because we think, whilst practically sometimes the people with the biggest guns manage to control things, we don't think that's actually ever legitimate. And this wasn't responded to in opposition. The only legitimate justification that you have to govern over other individuals, to restrict their choices, is for them to have chosen for you to do so in the first instance. That's why we like democracies so much, ladies and gentlemen, as a concept. And anything that tries to take that undermines that ideal. Go, sir.
With the threat of this writ, do you think people are more likely to negotiate with domestic opposition or hold elections, or more likely to rely on those guns and therefore limit people's choices more?
Okay, this is great. So this is the idea that somehow these people aren't afraid of being taken to the Hague at the moment because they have so much power to begin with. We say in those circumstances, the ICC won't be able to do anything and domestic courts won't be able to do anything. Sorry, we can't save the world in all circumstances. What we have done is we've actually shown you situations in Africa, or the guys that know most about Africa have. Like, they've shown you circumstances in which we have got countries on board and we have actually managed to bring these people to justice. We think that's really important. Okay, what's also the practical harms of sham democracies? No, because Shane Wu stands up and says, oh, it's great because then we get sort of the precursors to set up future democratic elections. We say, no. Because there is no incentive for that leader to set up a system which means it is unlikely for the incumbent to remain in power. We think that's pretty intuitive. So what you actually get is a sham democratic process, which makes it more likely to be entrenched over time. And also, here's the potential problem, is it means that people buy into the system less, because everything that they've got, which has been called democratic, this is apparently a precursor to something really good, is actually inherently bad for them. That's when people switch off and actually don't like the idea of a democratic system to begin with. Okay, so why do we think it's really important that we have the ICC? And first, I think it's important because we do have this some sort of objective standards. And we don't see it as being some sort of Western imperialism in Africa. I think it just happens that first Gov know quite a lot about Africa, and there's a lot of places in Africa which aren't particularly undemocratic, and that we may be able to do something about it. We don't see that as being an inherent contradiction. We also don't think the people in those circumstances are going to be particularly unhappy when we sort of indict their leaders for being such nasty people. But also, here's the other problem, the other thing we quite like, is that if we do set these norms from on high, these then start to filter down on a national level, and that national governments start to take action because they know it has been granted legitimacy from international bodies. Go, sir.
Can you name me a single case where we've managed to get a country that has not signed on to the ICC to nonetheless get it sitting head of state, which is presumably going to be the case, handed over to it.
Okay, great. I'm not going to play argument by example, Schengen. No, you can sit down. But at the end of the day, what we've done is given you the analysis, and first prop we've given you some examples because they're doing masters and all these sort of bloody things. We think they are out there. More importantly, we've shown you the analysis into why that would be the case. We don't just have to show it's worked in the past. We could show you that it hasn't worked thus far, but it could work in the future. But also, we think we've shown you anyway. Okay, so we think that's so. Finally, how will it work? Because we think we've shown the justification why it is democracy is inherent to humanity. We've shown the massive harms that sham democracies do cause practically fully, firstly the democratic ideal and also on a practical basis to enact future sort of democratic change, and why the ICC is justified in this. Okay, will it work? Well, firstly, we think where domestic courts can work, the ICC already lets them, so that's great, and we can see how this might encourage them to do that. It's better to be done in-house, which is apparently what Opt wants, as opposed to an international body. But also, we think if the dictator actually does have so much power that they're not afraid of the ICC, then we'll just look at other people. We're not going to be able to affect change all over the place, but sometimes we just have to sort of settle for the fact that if we can do it in some places, we can and we will. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, why do we work? Because I've shown you how democracy is inherent to humanity, because as soon as you try and have some sort of sham, that you only allow certain individuals to express their choices based on the fact they're apparently not human in some sort of progressive nature, then that goes against humanity. So we don't see it as being fundamentally about the ability to act life, and we think that the choice in terms of elections governs all the other choices which can be controlling you. We think there's a massive problem in terms of a legitimate justification for government unless you have the assent of the people, and it undermines your ability to have future democratic bodies, and we think the ICC is justified in doing everything it can work. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for his remarks. Call on the whip for the opposition credentials.
Ladies and gentlemen, what the Speaker just said was that we didn't reply to the idea that non-democracies aren't legitimate. Well, we agree non-democracies aren't legitimate. It's just that we don't think that your policy is actually going to do anything to create more democracies in the world anyway, or make them more, and make therefore democracy more legitimate form of democracy. And that's therefore your entire case gone. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to do is ask two main questions in this debate today. Will we actually be able to promote democracy and create more democracy in the world today? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, and this was our extension and the major even if that they really didn't deal with, even if we could do all this, and we accept all the many different things, is it worth paying the price of destroying the one international body that we have that is able to effectively prosecute genocide, ladies and gentlemen, with the cooperation of all the states in the world? We think on both these counts, they fall, ladies and gentlemen. But on the first count, ladies and gentlemen, will this actually promote democracy? So what we saw was that we came forth and we gave you three clear harms as a direct result of their policy that's going to result in democracy actually regressing in most of the countries that we're talking about that aren't full democracies right now. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we told you how it affects our ability to actually determine what level of democracy has been reached between one of these quasi-democracies. Because it's not just a binary condition that there are democracies and there aren't. There are different levels of democracy. There are different levels of vote rigging. There are different levels of intimidation of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen. And that shapes the way that we should respond to these countries. Which is exactly why we need UN observers on the ground, which is exactly why we need countries to accept observers on the ground. But when you create an incentive for these people to kick out the observers, because the message you're sending out is that basically if we find any evidence of vote rigging, you could be hauled off to court, you could be charged, ladies and gentlemen, then you destroy any incentive for them to keep these observers, for destroy any ability, ladies and gentlemen, for the West to actually determine what level of democracy is being achieved in the country. Are we moving better, or are we moving towards democracy, or are we moving away from democracy, ladies and gentlemen? They simply didn't deal with the point about observers. It's not simply about signaling whether you're a democracy or not, it's about the type of democracy, the type of moves towards democracy that are taking place in the country. And when we say that even though they may not be a full democracy yet, they may be taking steps to moving towards full democracy, and maybe we should reward them and nudge them in that direction. It's not a binary situation. They didn't deal with that point. They didn't deal with the nuanced foreign policy that observation on the ground allows us that they are destroying with their policy. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also came forth and tried to prove the idea that these are precursors to real democracy. And again, they didn't deal with the 3 levels of analysis that Sheng came forth and gave you about why these are precursors to real democracy and why it's therefore necessary for there to be quasi-democracies like South Africa that don't allow full enfranchisement of their people. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, because the very act of having an election, the very idea that a government says that its authority comes from the people is an important part of ensuring that later on you build up the support among the people and the institution of democracy in that country. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, it's the idea of making the institution of the ballot boxes. Again, they didn't respond to this. It's the idea that if you have a ballot box, the idea that there should be an election, ladies and gentlemen, then you are able to, and this is the third point, have a discourse that does include democracy, have a discourse that allows people like the ANC to say, we don't have full democracy in South Africa, and enfranchisement is not full, ladies and gentlemen. We allow these opposition groups within the country to use the discourse of true democracy and bring it to greater forth among the people, because the people have accepted the idea of the ballot box. The people have accepted the idea of the authority of the people. What they encourage is there being no elections whatsoever. We would like there to be some fake elections first, ladies and gentlemen, because at least that way there is a greater chance that in future there's going to create institutions that lead to true democracy, that lead to true elections, and they didn't deal with that point. Yes, Will.
Okay, in which case, can you respond to James's 7 minutes on how electoral authoritarian regimes set up formal institutions which block real democratization and destroy all public faith in democracy in the long term?
Sir, that's exactly what we just said. We said that since these places aren't true democracies, these institutions that you're talking about don't go on from one election to another, ladies and gentlemen. What we're talking about is the institution, the idea of there being a ballot box, the idea of there being an authority of the people. These are constant and inherent in the idea of there being an election at all. You haven't actually proven these other vague institutions that we've talked about. We're talking about allowing opposition groups to have a discourse that they can co-opt to push for true democracy in these countries. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that there was a harm in creating a binary world in which there are democracies and non-democracies, and we pushed them away. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this was our entire extension which wasn't really dealt with, because even if, ladies and gentlemen, even if we could have this idea that we're going to promote democracy, it's not worth paying the price of destroying the ability of the ICC to prosecute genocide, ladies and gentlemen, of destroying the neutrality of the ICC and its ability to effectively say that it has the moral force of the entire world behind it when it chooses to prosecute genocide. So firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we came forth and told you about, and we don't care about, there was this bit throughout the debate on the first half, ladies and gentlemen, about whether or not democracy was an inherent human right. We don't really care. The point is that countries like China don't see it that way, ladies and gentlemen. They don't see it as an ideologically neutral position for the ICC to take. And these are exactly the kind of countries that we're going to be losing, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of whether or not it is ideologically neutral. The point is that the type of countries with whom we need cooperation don't see it as ideologically neutral, and therefore aren't going to cooperate with the ICC because they'll see it as an institution that is inherently biased in favour of Western liberal democratic values and against their own countries, ladies and gentlemen. They're trying to seek to haul away their own people at every opportunity. We gave you additional analysis about this, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that the ICC often operates in conflict zones, ladies and gentlemen, where democracies haven't been established, where the government is very unstable. Places like Cambodia, who currently allow and cooperate to a large extent with the ICC in terms of giving evidence, in terms of pursuing and handing over the criminals that we want to see brought to justice to the ICC, exactly because they don't see it as an ideologically neutral body. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you how it's going to harm it in terms of, because, believe it or not, the countries that dictators like to flee to tend to also not be democracies, ladies and gentlemen. So we want, when Charles Taylor flees to another African country, whose democracy is dubious, ladies and gentlemen, we want that country to still want to cooperate with us. We want that country to see the ICC as an ideologically neutral body who isn't going to turn around and try and take out their heads of government, ladies and gentlemen. When we lose that ideological neutrality, regardless of whether or not it is in fact an ideologically neutral position, the fact that all the countries that we want cooperation with, in terms of the places where these genocides are taking place, and in terms of the places where these people are going to be fleeing to, ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the kind of thing we don't want happening. The ICC currently is doing a good job. The reason it's doing a good job is because it's ideologically neutral. We think we've proven to you that in order for it to be able to effectively carry out its function as a prosecutor of genocide, we need to maintain these countries on side, and therefore we stand in opposition.
Diminishing capacity of the ICC.
Wow.